Rite of the Nine was a weird experience. The Destiny community was ready for another Pantheon, another saving grace to an otherwise lackluster year of seasons to shape everything up for the next major era in Destiny. Rite of the Nine was supposed to be that, a dungeon rotation that focused on reinvigorating the loot and shaping up some older dungeons to bring them into more modern times. And in many ways it was like Pantheon, but in more ways it wasn't. So was Rite of the Nine a success? Did it right all of the wrongs that Destiny had made in the follow-ups to the final shape's mega critical success? Or was Rite of the Nine a disappointment, much like the episodes of this year? Let's just not sugarcoat it. The main reason players are upset about Rite of the Nine is that there is a soft sunsetting happening going into Edge of Fate, rendering these weapons not useless, but not the most optimal or new or exciting. It's a perplexing decision to make the bridge activity into Edge of Fate, you know, that final, let's get excited for Edge of Fate, let's do this, let's grind, let's get everybody together, lose all of its momentum knowing what you're doing won't really have any impact for the upcoming stuff. Unlike Pantheon, which clearly planted its feet and said you're gonna need to be ready for the Witness, so get geared up with loot drops and test your might against hard raid bosses, Rite of the Nine just doesn't have that same kind of urgency. It feels like a better version of Moments of Triumph and Solstice, which are seasonal events to wrap up a year and complete some challenges for cosmetics with a few weapons that are just okay, like they're good, but they're not insane. This was easily the biggest outlier of feedback from the Destiny community on the thread I posted on Twitter, and this is what people had to say. Also, go ahead and follow me on Twitter while you're at it, you goober. Pabo says, weapons are okay, they're still underwhelming, especially knowing that they're going to be power crept immediately. Where Maroof says, Into the Light gave us weapons that were viable for the future, and the hunt for shinies felt more valued. Better perks tended to drop on shinies. Rite of the Nine is asking us to farm for gear that will be objectively worse than the new things on July 15th, and the number of shinies with synergy less perks combos is appalling. While Lux says it's kind of in a weird spot. It's nice to have the dungeons revamped with a pseudo contest mode, but outside of doing it once, there's really no reason to farm for the weapons, especially with Edge of Fate around the corner. I have a feeling that these weapons will be outclassed soon. There were some other serious problems with Rite of the Nine out the gate, and a lot of them were hard to ignore. Even if you like the idea of refreshed dungeon loot, and even more so if you were looking for an excuse to get on the game, the event was a step down from Bungie's Into the Light, which obviously featured Pantheon. Time gating was a massive one that so many people responded to the thread with. Bungie has a habit of stretching content thin, and Rite of the Nine fell into that same trap. Players were forced to wait weeks to get the full picture, and that kind of pacing kills momentum. It wasn't even once a week for a new dungeon revamp. It was every 3 weeks originally, then changed to every 2 weeks. On top of that, this event had the unfortunate reality that it accidentally released early with all modes and loot available for a few hours. This killed any wonder or mystery at the mechanics changes that were coming to the dungeon encounters on the actual release, and that was a huge part of the fun that Pantheon before it nailed. So for those of you who are unaware, Pantheon was a raid boss gauntlet that would get harder every single week, with the first week being an easier difficulty version with 4 bosses to fight. While it was time gated to add more bosses later on, Pantheon was helped by the fact that Into the Light was a bigger event that already had another mode called Onslaught, which dropped a massive loot pool of some of Destiny 2's most iconic weapons. Rite of the Nine and Into the Light, which featured Pantheon, are both free to play, but Pantheon had much better loot, meaning that players who didn't have raid loot and raid exotics could get them for completing each week's challenge. So it blended a lot of elements nicely together to the point that many didn't care that Pantheon was time gated. Rite of the Nine, however, wasn't as carefully thought out in that way. It felt time gated just for the sake of feeling time gated. The weapons from Rite of the Nine were also not nearly as desirable, not just in the fact that they are going to get soft sunset, but the roles of these weapons are just not the heavy hitters that you'd want going into, well, a whole year of content. I can't believe that there wasn't a must-have from this event. At that point, the main driving force and incentive is pretty much just shader variants on guns with the holofoils, which only really works when you'd actually want to use these weapons. I can't even tell you how long I spent grinding for an edge transit with the perfect rolls with a shiny variant. If it wasn't shiny, I just didn't want it because I actually wanted to use edge transit and show it off to everybody. The weapons in Rite of the Nine are fun for people who never got to use these weapons to begin with, but then I also have to think that the people who are even going to play dungeons are people who probably aren't going to use these roles because they're just not optimal, which then makes me wonder who this event was really targeted for. D2 Revenant says Rite of the Nine weapons are Some are good, but versus Into the Light, all of them were good. The dungeon selection also just felt off in my opinion. I know that contest dungeons have been a great change for Destiny. Vespers and Sunder Doctrine are some of my favorites ever made, but Spire of the Watcher and Ghost of the Deep would not be my choices for a contest dungeon revamp. These dungeons are not the heavy hitters like Duality, Shattered Throne, Grasp of Avarice, and Warlord's Ruin, and I get that Bungie wanted to pick these dungeons that could use a revamp in some ways. Ultimatum mode cannot fix 20 minutes of swimming for air bubbles, nor can it make me like fighting a giant chicken with legs in a nuclear reactor core. I think had the dungeon selection been a little bit better to make room for new roles, or at least some more thought go into the dungeons that have weapons that I actually would want to bring into Edge of Fate. Rocket Pistol and Warlord's Ruin. Linear Fusion Rifle, SMG, and Grenade Launcher from Duality. Then there could be a bigger conversation here. Fafnir replied with, "Wish they gave us some dungeons like Warlords instead of Spire." But then he said, "I actually like Ghost of the Deep." So you're wrong, Fafnir! The biggest response that I felt by reading through all of these is that Rite of the Nine was fighting a losing battle. Pantheon was just so good, and Into the Light was just so memorable. They felt more curated and focused than Rite of the Nine, which just didn't hit with the same energy. And I know that comparison is the thief of joy, but again, this is the bridge activity to show us a taste of Edge of Fate. It needed to just be on the same rails or better than Pantheon to really rally the Destiny community. Every type of player was either whelmed or underwhelmed with Rite of the Nine, and I don't want Bungie to stop making these events just because of one mediocre response, but just take the feedback on the chin and make something even bigger. And thankfully, after coming back to this, it looks like they are, according to a dev insight from last year, which even outlines in the TLDR that every year will kick off with a brand new raid. The following major update, they'll add some new twists, challenges, and rewards to those raids, and then the second expansion will deliver a new dungeon with expanded rewards. But the biggest one for this video is that the fourth and final major update of every year will launch with an event that leverages legacy raids and dungeon content along the lines of Pantheon. So are we getting a Rite of the Nine, or are we getting a Pantheon? That's to be seen in future years. Now, you may be listening to this video and missing out on something very important in your life. I know that earbuds are necessary to get through the day, and nobody likes hearing the screaming baby on a plane. Nobody wants to sit on a train ride without a nice song or a podcast listening in their ears. It's a no-brainer that earbuds are helpful, but they can get really expensive, and normally if you go with the more affordable option, then they lose the sound quality and comfort. But with Raycon's wireless noise-canceling earbuds, you can stay focused on whatever you want to, on the go. Hey, if you're not even on the go, then that's fine. You can swap from your phone to your laptop or your PC by using the multi-point connectivity feature. What's nice is that these earbuds even have a 32-hour battery life, so you're not punished for being a human and forgetting to charge them. I personally love these and use them when I'm working out, when I'm cooking, or when I'm just going on a walk outside. You can use my link in the description and go to buyraycon.com/evanf1997. If you want to check them out, hit the link down below and get 15% off the everyday earbuds. Thanks to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Look, for every frustration Rite of the Nine came with, it wasn't all bad. There was even some massive wins in the activity. Difficulty modes were a really nice addition, and having tutorial modes built into the dungeon on the easiest mode is super helpful when you think about it, because it means Bungie can make the hard mode really hard, because there is a place for you to build up to that point. It expressed clearly in the Explorer mode how everything would work, and I'm impressed at how clear visually these Explorer mode dungeons were. The community also agreed across the board that this was a good idea, so kudos to Bungie for adding difficulty options and a tutorial mode of the dungeons. Speaking of those harder difficulties, there were some improvements that really stood out from the original versions of the dungeons. Order of operations, for example, for Spire of the Watcher was really nice. Same with just having one less round in Ghost of the Deep's first encounter. You have no idea how much better it is to have 3 rounds instead of 4, and I don't think I can go back to regular Ghost of the Deep after doing that. And Prophecy called for you to actually engage in the desert section, and in general for the dungeons, there was a lot more emphasis on mechanics versus the original. I especially loved whenever a new boss would just appear after completing an easier section from the original. It was a welcome surprise, and it shows that there was some revamped love put in here. The ultimatum mode was a net positive overall. Even if some of the modifiers just made some weeks preferable over others, I hope they can make modifiers that make the raids more fun to engage with in a new way instead of making modifiers that feel kind of tedious. I like when Bungie just does weird stuff. Like, does anyone remember Mini Scream modifier? That one was great. Bring that back. I also love the inclusion of some ads that were nukes and some that called for you to punch them to break the shield. Please keep building off of that concept because it just called for more of that urgency that I haven't seen in Destiny endgame activities since Salvation's Edge. And yeah, with Rite of the Nine, even if it wasn't perfect, it's just better than the alternative of not getting a Rite of the Nine. Would I rather have something like Rite of the Nine than another vendor refresh? Absolutely. So was Rite of the Nine a success? That really just depends on what you value. If you just want more endgame activities, it definitely delivered. But if you wanted Bungie to push the formula of Pantheon forward, it probably just felt like a missed opportunity. Either way, let me know what you thought in the comments down below. Was this just a stopgap to keep us busy, or was there something worth more to build off of? Drop your takes down below, and you can just join me on stream at EvanF1997, where we can have a real long chat about it there. Appreciate you guys, and I'll talk to you guys soon for some mega videos.